And we've done work in different parts of the world, I'll show you later. And basically we work through 4 pillars. First, applying an intersectional gender perspective, which is not only understanding how gender and sex contributes or conditions how men, women, and people with non-binary identities use the spaces, but also that this identity is always interconnected with other identity variables like age, like race, like ethnicity, like origin, migration status, disability, etc. And we try to apply this to all our projects. It's kind of our main pillars. To apply that, we work a lot through community participation. So I'll share with you some of the examples of community participation. We also, one of the pillars is sustainability, and we try to practice sustainability through an ecofeminist perspective. And also let's talk on that a little bit. And as I said, we are a nonprofit cooperative, so we are part of the solidarity and feminist economy here in the city, which is a small part of the sector, but excited to try to contribute to that. So as I say, we've been working in the last 15 years on from a feminist perspective in urban planning around the world, in projects on architecture and urban planning, but also community participation and engagement, doing activism and raising awareness, capacity building for municipal staff, but also for other organizations, women's groups and neighborhood organizations. And always that we can, even though we are not a formal research institution, we do research, above all feminist participatory action research, which I will also share with you. And as you see, we do a lot of work in Spain, but we work a lot also in the Americas, above all in Latin America and some places in North Africa. So what is our point of departure? We basically criticize the way that cities have been planned through history and worldwide, right? We've been promoting cities and politicians have been promoting a way of constructing cities that responds to a capitalist and patriarchal system, right? That they understand growth as something always positive and understanding the cities that can grow without limits. And that's why we have mega cities around the world today. And also privileging capital accumulation and the benefits of a few. Something that, as you know, I don't say anything that you don't know, increases inequalities, but also not only inequalities in terms of gender, because this system, as Silvia Federici, a feminist economist, says, the capitalist and the patriarchal system are always connected, are inseparable. There are cities that focus above all in being more productive and in consumption, but also these type of cities have kind to do cut and paste models of city from an ethnocentric and colonial perspective, trying to replicate certain parts, certain aspects of planning and architecture in different parts of the world without respecting the history and the ancestors that have been lived there. We believe that this type of city is toxic and reproduces social inequalities. And in response of that, there are a group of feminists in academia, but also in activism that have been working for including a feminist perspective in planning since the 70s. So some examples of this type of cities, what has promoted androcentric urban planning and design that basically has privileged spaces that are car dependent, right? A mobility that's totally sustainable, and also is a pattern of mobility that is mostly male or conducted by men, and that's what mobility statistics says in many places around the world, but also what types of facilities they are promoting, right? For example, when we are planning facilities in terms of leisure and consumption, oftentimes they have an androcentric perspective. When we decide to invest in putting grass in a soccer field without asking first to the people in that neighborhood or that municipality if that is the essential facility. I always put the example that it's something that has been done continuously in this country, even funding grass soccer fields in small towns like 3,000 inhabitants, when it's a sport practiced mostly by men, but also when you ask the population, it's not the sport that it's the most practiced by the population. The first is swimming and the second is running. So basically we have ask questions about where we put the money, for whom, with which purpose, which objectives, and what are we going to get from that. So basically, feminist urban planning proposed to change totally this system and break with these priorities and change the priorities and put the everyday life of people in their diversity at the center of urban planning decisions. And for that, we study the city and plan the city through understanding the everyday life of the diverse people that live in a particular neighborhood, town, etc. And I'll get a little bit more into that. Also, we believe that we have to break the barriers and the dichotomy that exists between the experts, which are usually the trained urban planners or architects, and the neighbors and the residents, because we believe that the residents are the experts of their territory because they live them on an everyday life basis. They know what are their needs, and they know what things they can propose also to improve the life of that neighborhood, of that town. So for that, we need community participation to really include this diversity in the planning processes. And a third element that is important is to acknowledging also how gender violence impacts women's right to the city. And that would be kind of like the third pillar of feminist urban planning. As I said, we are not the first ones on using this perspective. It's been there for more than 50 years now. And basically, there were theories that support to put at the center of planning policies everyday life. What we understand by everyday life is the activities that we do on an everyday basis, and we have classified them in four spheres. The productive sphere, which is the one of the paid work and employment, but then we have all the activities related with the reproduction of our society and lives, which is the reproductive and domestic sphere, all the unpaid work that is related with care, and that still today most of the care work is developed by women. Women dedicate double of time in domestic tasks than men. But then also the community participation sphere that is related with activism, volunteer, be volunteer in organization, and political engagement in your community. And the fourth one, the personal sphere, that one related more with your personal care and time. In an ideal community, city, these four spheres will be in an equilibrium. There will be a lot of attention on how to support care and the reproduction of life. In our current society, in the context of a capitalism patriarchal city, we have cities that are focused on the productive spheres, or how to produce more, and the other spheres are satellites of these productive spheres. And all the schedules and all the spaces are often adapted to a type of work that is standardized and that often are based on male heteronormative patterns related with white men with a full-time job and full capabilities. So with this critique and with the focus of putting the everyday life at the center, we also incorporate the learnings from ecofeminism to our work to analyze also and make visible how the global environmental crisis is totally linked to the global crisis of care. Ecofeminists have said also for decades that we cannot understand the environmental crisis related with climate change, water access, energy crisis, etc., without understanding the care crisis that we have had for decades too. Surpassing human times, especially women's times. Women have a double and a triple shift on their lives, and we still have countries and systems, and we have seen that more than ever in the current pandemic, that don't support care, and that the care oftentimes is on the shoulders of family and home, and that means on the shoulders of women. So ecofeminism proposes to recover the values related with care, to apply them to the ecosystem's care, and things care in a broader spectrum. We have to take an ethics of society and with nature. With that idea in mind, a colleague of us, and in collaboration with Colectivo.cis, Blanca Valdivia, has worked through her PhD dissertation the paradigm from where we want to work, which is the city of care. How we define the city of care? First, we the part that of different definitions of care Amaya Perez Orozco, of Ecofeminist, a feminist economist, criticized that the classic economic focus on the market and capitalist accumulation becomes the center, while human needs are unattended. While Joan trying to say that activities that include all the things that we do to continue and repair our world the best way possible, either close our bodies, our beings, and our environment. When we place care at the center, we understand that people depend physically and emotionally on the time that other people give us. And we understand that we are all in this world dependent and interdependent, and also eco-dependent in our systems. For that reason, care should be a social and a public responsibility and not a women's responsibility. And for that, we always work to overcome the model of heteronormative nuclear families and understand that care goes beyond families' relations. As I say, pay and unpaid care is mostly carried out by women at homes and in the public space. It's something that also transcends barriers. There is not a dichotomy that care happens only at home. There are a lot of care activities that happen in the public space. And when we define the city of care, we understand that a city of care is the one that allows to take care, a city that takes care of us, in the sense that analyzes how pollution impact on people and how we can work for cities, for example, less polluted, less also polluted in terms of electromagnetisms or all the debate about the 5G and the Wi-Fi, and making visible that the impact of pollution on women is worse, because women physiologically have more fat tissues, and that makes that we absorb faster some of the pollutants. The city of care is also a city that takes care of us, in the sense that it has, it's equipped by different elements that accompany our activities in their everyday life. It has benches that accompanies our everyday life paths and mobility. It has pedestrian networks and cycling networks that are universally accessible and promote autonomy and freedom in the public space. It's also a city that has sort of public toilets from a gender perspective, understanding that this is a basic need that has been violated in most of the cities because they don't have a public toilet system, but also it's a city that invests in public transportation and all the infrastructure that is around public transportation. It's also a city that allows to take care of us, the things on how we also enjoy the time of leisure and exercise from a gender perspective, understanding the diversity of needs of the people and of the free times, and also values the self-care time that is also so limited, in particular in women's lives. And finally, it's a city that cares about the environment and promotes green spaces, community gardens, and also has programs, public programs of water management and waste management. And takes care of others, using diversifying the activities that can happen in a public space, promoting elements that support care in our public spaces, and also working for the reconciliation of time and activities. With that in mind, with that paradigm, how we analyze that and represent that in our work. So we work basically analyze the urban level through 6 variables that are not separated. They are all interacting between each other. One is community participation, public space. We work on services and facilities, mobility and networks, infrastructures, issues of safety that have an impact differently on men and women, and housing. And I'm going to share just some examples of community participations that we have done in the later years. So basically, as I say, this is one of the pillars, because we believe that the experts of a community are the residents in their diversity. And for that, we promote women's participation as experts and neighbors, because women have historically been excluded above all of urban planning and architecture projects, either as experts or as residents. But also for that, we promote different challenges in a space of participation, always using an intersectional gender perspective. That means that sometimes we do processes exclusively with women, but other times we apply an intersectional perspective when we do separate groups of participation with people with disabilities, with youth, with children, to try to create a safe spaces for them to share their needs and also proposals. We also support community action, bottom up, don't impose ingredients, because sometimes some of the community participation processes that come from the institutions try to push a little bit too harder to the communities. And in all other projects, we give visibility to the reproductive and care sphere, to the safety issues, and we are always aware of the gender roles and socialization in the participatory process in itself, being very alert of dynamics of silencing of particular groups, of mainstreaming and others. Over these years, we have developed different methods, feminist participatory methods. They are all open access. You can access them through the website and download it. Mostly they are in Catalan and Spanish, but also you can find a couple of guides in English. And finally, to finish, I just want to share some of the projects that we have done related also with more active and sustainable mobility. So departing from the data that we have, quantitative and qualitative data, and that also has been argued by many feminists working on this topic, women have more sustainable, complex, and diverse mobility than men. We usually move more on foot and public transportation. But also, we have a more complex and diverse mobility because we move between spaces, but not in a linear way, but in a polygonal way. Although most mobility systems have been thought in this way, thinking of a person with a job, but with no responsibility going from point 1 to B. But however, women have like a more sustainable mobility, but they have faced different problems, right? They face feminization of poverty that limit access to transportation. They live more but have worse work conditions of life. They also experience gender violence in their mobility, and as I said, impact of pollution on women's health. And all to that, even though we are the major users of public transportation, we lack representation in mobility and transportation institutions. So to try to respond to that and change that, we have conducted different projects these years. Feminist participatory action research, for example, to related with night mobility, we conducted a participatory project with 24 women night shift workers in the Barcelona metropolitan area to analyze how issues of safety condition the mobility of women that work in different sectors at night. And we were able to collect a lot of qualitative data at the metropolitan level that also has influenced some regional policies. For example, to create a request stop at night in some bus night routes in Barcelona. And more recently, we have done a study on bike mobility with women and non-binary people to study the bike mobility in Barcelona from a feminist perspective, because there has been an infrastructure developed, but without this perspective. And the infrastructure has not had in account how there are certain aspects of safety, perceptions, and also how maternity conditions and know your access to the bike. We have done also a lot of work in terms of safety, analyzing how gender violence impact on women's right to the city through exploratory walks. In between the last 3 years, we have conducted more than 46 exploratory walks in more than 27 municipalities in Catalonia. And also we have worked in processes of active mobility. For example, working with municipalities to create walking school bus, placing care at the center, working with elders to create a network of benches in a district in Barcelona, in the Eixample, to support their everyday life activities, or working with the city of Barcelona to pacify one of the main avenues they have worked forever as a highway and not an avenue. We have also conducted a safety audit from a gender perspective in the Catalan railway company, the Ferrocarrils de la Generalitat de Catalunya. And I want to finish with this, that is like starting now, a little bit of stop because of the current crisis. But on March 8th, we won the March 8th prize of the city of Barcelona that every year the city gives to a feminist initiative. The topic was, and we presented a project with one of the UrbanA partners, which is the Barcelona Environmental and Justice Institute here. And we won the prize to implement a network of climate and care refugees in La Prosperitat, which is in the district of Nou Barris, one neighborhood in the periphery of Barcelona with a lack of green spaces and care spaces. And I'll finish with that.
Great timing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, Renata Moreno from Colombia. She's asking, how did you get the gender issue enter the urban planning agenda? If it's okay, I can explain a little bit more about the history of the movement. So what I said at the beginning is that what we are doing now, it's not something new. There have been either planners, architects, geographers, social scientists from the feminist academia, but also from the feminist movement. They have been working including a gender perspective in planning. At the beginning, it was not more a gender perspective, it was how spaces were responding or not to women, because usually they were developed from a more heteronormative male perspective. So we have a lot of experiences and pressure and advocacy in the Anglo-Saxon world in countries like North America and also the UK. But also starting in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, we start to have a lot of experience also in practice in cities and also by community organizations. For example, in the UK, we have the experience of Matrix, which was also a co-op of architects that work in community projects of architecture. They were all women working on that. And also we have the experiences of the Women's Design Service that also they were designing different guides about how to make cities more diverse and respond to the needs of the diversity, to elders, to women, to caretakers, etc. In other parts of the world, it also comes, and I think it's also related with the Beijing 95, when this gender perspective starts to be kind of in the discourse, in the public discourse, that cities start to apply this perspective. We have the examples of Montreal and Toronto that they work a lot on women's safety. And that also was replicated later in many cities in Latin America, not coming much from governments, but from the Red Mujer y Hábitat de America Latina, which were like different feminist organizations through the territory that want to put and make visible the women's safety in the urban agenda. Then we have the experience more from the institution of Vienna. Vienna is the example of the city. They have for more than 10 years an office that was to include an everyday life and agenda perspective in the urban planning of Vienna. And Eva Kyle, who was an engineer, was at the head of this office. And they did a lot of pilot projects. One of the pilot projects, and there is a lot of information that you can find on the internet, also in English, was in the neighborhood of Maria Hilfiger, where they did interventions in terms of walking and active mobility, and also they did a housing project, the Frauenstadt project, that I think that it has now the name of one one architect from Austria. And in that housing project, there was also applied a gender perspective. It was a project designed by women and for women. And then we have also the work related with the infrastructures of everyday life in the north of Europe, with all the Nordic scholars from Sweden, Finland, Norway, for example, with Lisa Horelli, who is an environmental psychologist working on that. So I think that all this history has also contributed to why agenda perspective has entered in the urban agenda. There has been a lot of advocacy also for feminist groups around the world, and that is work that has been spread by other parts of the world, in India, in cities in Asia like Seoul, but also in Africa, like in South Africa, or in some parts of the West Africa. And in Spain, it came also by the feminist movement and also by the influences the legislation that forced the legislation since the 2000s forced urban planning policies to include a gender perspective. That's what the law says. Of course, later, or in practice, it's more difficult to implement, because it's when you find some of the barriers of the people who are working in the actual projects. Okay, so Belén Iturralde asked about the superblocks in Barcelona, that she's doing research on the superblocks from a feminist perspective. It's interesting that you are interested in that. We have received different emails from people, from actually students, women students that are trying to research that. We have to say that from the start, the superblocks don't have a feminist perspective. It has an ecological and a sustainable perspective, in the sense of course, promoting like a more sustainable mobility, reduce the space of cars. For example, how we support care infrastructures in the superblocks, or how we make sure that the superblocks are also felt as a safe space for women at different times of the day, is not something that has been included in its conception. But there are some students that have done some analysis. So Belén, if you email us, I'll be happy to put you in contact with some of these students. Ana Terras, in which ways we can create a more feminist, caring, safe cities in places that are very spread out and have low density? Well, that's a huge challenging, Anna. And hello, Anna. Nice to see you around here. It's challenging because what we do with all the suburbs and all the sprawl that happen in many urban territories. There are work done on that. We did a research in the past, some years ago, almost 10 years ago, coordinated by Zaida Murshi, which is a feminist architecture and one of the founders of Collectiu Puncis, to analyze suburbs from a gender perspective and propose actions to improve everyday life, and try to work in this low density, how it can respond better, like thinking in a diverse spectrum, right? And in terms of how, for example, improve mobility and not only dependent in single car use, but how to share mobility, how to also think in the public space and the facilities or the grocery stores in those areas that can be more integrated in those types of neighborhoods. That was more a research project that is published in a book called Post Suburbia. But also some years ago, a few years ago, we did an actual project with a region here in Catalonia, in the south of Barcelona, in the region of Garraf, which is kind of a region close to the sea that has a lot of suburbs. And we did a lot of recommendations that the different municipalities of that region are trying to implement in order to improve everyday life of people from this care perspective, but it's very challenging. All right, Natalia says, to the urban regeneration programs, do you have any experience evaluating with a gender perspective? Well, we have experience evaluating with a gender perspective. I'm not sure what you mean by urban regeneration programs, but yeah, as I said, we have developed, adapted, created different methodologies through the years. And one of the publications that we have is Espacios para la Vida Cotidiana, which comes from the dissertation of our colleague Adriana. And we designed a set of indicators to evaluate quality of life from a gender perspective at 3 scales. At the scale of the neighborhoods, at the scale of a facility, a public facility, and at the scale of a public space. And they can be adapted. We use that material also in our training sessions, and maybe it's more difficult to evaluate kind of like not urban areas, but it's a tool that we have. And the other thing is that we this is the harder part, evaluate. A lot of the work that we have done is related with doing assessments, doing audits, doing even proposals to include in the planning projects. But even institutions, they are many times kind of reticent to evaluate, either because they don't have the money or I don't know. So that's the harder part. But we always that we work in creating indicators. For example, we are working now in mobility projects, and some of the mobility projects we are creating indicators to evaluate how gender is including in that particular infrastructure. For example, in public transportation infrastructures or on bike infrastructure. Okay, I'll continue. Let's see if we have time for everything. Do you think, Nicolas says, do you think that patriarchal ways of organizing continue because we are culturally conditioned to think that the rational mind is more important than the body consciousness? I don't know, Nicolas, if I can answer this question. I think we live in a very patriarchal and sexist world. And an example is that still there are few countries that have women's leader on the head, and we have countries with men leaders that are doing crazy things, and nobody kicked them out of the powers. So, and I don't think that they have rational minds, neither body consciousness. So it's a question of privilege. And I think that also to eliminate patriarchal structures, there are people that also have to be willing to not have certain privileges. And I think that's the difficult part, that the people who are in privileged positions share or their privileges or are willing to let them go some of the privilege. Okay, Christian Mayer says that I would be interested in the question how a city or urban planning could contribute in giving more value to care reproduction, mostly done by women. This question relates to feminist economy, understanding labor in broader sense than only pay work. Yeah, totally. That's part of our work. So part of our work when we do participatory processes is to make visible the unpaid care reproduction work that most women conduct. So this is part of like when we do participatory processes. I'm going to share with you, Christian, one of the examples that we are working on in doing a pilot project in a neighborhood here in Barcelona, in Poblenou. We are working to create a network of care in a neighborhood that's related with different types and typologies of housing. The goal is that care has to go out from the home. It cannot remain only at home because care has to be a community and a public responsibility. And through this network, we are working with different organizations in the neighborhood. They are of them provide services, for example, services that are already community. For example, there is a bike cooperative, right, that provides bike services. There is also a services that supports elder people who live alone. There are also youth organizations or co-op housing groups that might be interested to be part of this network of care, with the idea to create soft and hard infrastructure in the neighborhood, which is connected and allows people to be able to share the care of children, the care of dependents, but also that promotes the autonomy. If, for example, elder people live alone, right? That there are people in the neighborhood that can support there, for example, with the grocery shopping or with their care, but also that maybe these elder people, if they want, can be kind of foster grandparents to families that have kids, but maybe they don't have grandparents close, right? With the whole goal to make sure that care is not only in the hands of women. That project was finalist in a smart city context last year. We were one of the 3 finalists. We didn't win, I think because we were too feminist, but we are trying to implement that now with small grants that we are receiving. Okay, Maria Friend in what ways do you think that feminist appropriation in the city in terms of activism and language, demonstrations, thesis performance in Chile, gender inclusive language in Fiti and street, intersects with the appropriation of the city in terms of urban planning? What you say, Mariana, it's essential. It's something that we always propose, that in the public spaces, it's not enough with physical changes. And of course, urban planning is also one of the elements, but there are other elements that has to change in terms of the economy, in terms of the education, of social structures in order to change of cities from this perspective. So all the appropriation of the city by women, it's essential, either because you advocate, for example, to increment the number of streets in your city that have a name after a woman, which is something that is rarely, for example, here in this country. But of course, performance like Las Tesis, that for sure has influenced how women are aware of the use of the public space, or of course, street art, public art, graffitis that make visible women's contributions to society, to city building in a positive way, and eliminating those representations that they society or a violent society, such as sexist advertisement in the public space, that I think they should be prohibited, as well as racist and homophobic advertisement, but also kind of figures that represent and kind of like emphasize certain ways of seeing history, right? When we kind of put statues of like dictators or men who have been battling in wars as people who are important. So we have to change that perspective too. Anathelia asked, what kind of indicators can you design to evaluate the success of the projects? Well, the indicators oftentimes come, you have to do an assessment first before doing any project, right? And you have to know how is the situation before you do any change, right? So I think the indicator starts doing that assessment and analyzing what is the problem, how is the need, how is that space working, and then finding the ways to analyze the impact of the transformation in a short, medium, and long term in that space. And that evaluation can be done also with the participation of people, right? Something that sometimes we do in public transportation infrastructures, when before a train station is open, that people with disabilities here in Spain, people who are blind, go to test if everything was well built or constructed in terms of blind accessibility, right? While we don't do that in terms of ecofeminism or gender or or diversity, it's something that we can do to try to test an infrastructure or space a time before, and then, of course, doing a post evaluation. Okay, Duncan says 10 minutes left. Finally, Marcia asked, we have spoken about public space and the importance of care as a public responsibility. I've wondered if you ever made a project in which working in a domestic context allow the caring practices to resonate in the public sphere. Mara, I can talk a little bit about our perspective or introducing this feminist perspective in housing projects, right? When I didn't present today, but also we work in kind of rethinking the way we think housing. It's something that has been applied in Vienna in these housing projects that I say, and in other parts of the world. But first we have to acknowledge that we are oftentimes building housing for a particular model of family, right? The nuclear family, a couple with kids. And in many cities around the world, and in many places, this model of family starts to be the minority of the households in a city. In Barcelona, I think it accounts for a little bit more than the 30%. So on one hand, we have to start rethinking the way that we think household. For whom is this home, this housing, right? That is more flexible. But also, when we think of housing, is how housing has perpetuated gender inequalities through the mistreatment, I think, the domestic activities in the private space. And I don't know in your context in Geneva, but in many contexts, I'll put the example of Spain, but it happens also in other countries, that housing over the time has been built thinking that, kind of hiding the domestic activities, right? They try to sell us housing that is always clean and ready to use. And in the house, it happened many things, right? So the architects have built for years like kitchens that are small, that are closed, that are very far away or separated from the living room or the space where we eat with the group that you eat. And not thinking and how it's the experience of the person who is cooking. And that has had like a gender implication, isolating the person who has been in the kitchen cooking, right, from the social life of the household. So one proposal is to rethink these spaces, how we think kitchens, for example, and there has been a lot of work wrote about kitchens in many places by different architects. But also another example that we always put back, for example, is all the relation with the cycle of the clothes cycling, how we do the laundry, right? Many housing projects don't think of that. Don't think of where you put the dirty laundry when you have to wash the laundry, where you wash it, where you dry it, where you iron it, and where you store it, right? There are a lot of housing that has forget about it and not responded to that. And that also is in the detriment of the everyday life activities and the domestic activities. So we should start making visible these activities. And we believe that making visible these activities also can contribute to start sharing the activities between the different peoples of the household. That's kind of an introduction. I'm afraid that we are running out of time. But it's something that we work also with in our capacity building, for example, with architects. For years, we have run a workshop called The House Without Gender, to actually analyze the gender of how housing has been designed. And also, for example, currently we are providing advice to a feminist housing co-op here in Barcelona, that they want to include this perspective in the process of thinking the spaces and also designing the spaces. And we are using this workshop and doing some advice through the representation, because some people think that co-op housing is automatically gives more gender equality, and that's not the case always. For being co-op, that doesn't mean that it's not, it doesn't perpetuate certain gender inequalities. And finally, Sophia from Freework and Toronto. We are some of the most common critiques or pushbacks against the main messages of your work. What are some of the most critiques or pushbacks against the main messages of your work? Who is voicing them, and how do you respond? Okay, well, the critiques come from different places, from spaces of resistance, as well as the people who are voicing them. So to give practical examples, in certain municipalities, there might be the politicians, even like a feminist or a women politicians that call us because she's in charge of the equity department, or the equity department and the urban planning department, and they want to include this feminist perspective in their policies. So they call us, and I think they search us also as allies of how that can permeate the whole institution. And then, not always, but sometimes the pushbacks or the critiques comes when you go to do a capacity building with the municipal staff at that municipality. That there are, certain people that are resistant to that, right? Again, many times has to do with the privilege that we have to give away to kind of introduce this perspective. Other times it's kind of fear. If you introduce this perspective in your work, I always say that in a feminist perspective, it's something that kind of mainstream your whole life or transform your whole life. Not only, you cannot separate work from your personal life. It's something that makes you revisit everything in your life. So some of the critiques come from this fear of kind of reviewing the way that we live the spaces, right? Or the way that our lives have been constructed, and it might be painful. And other times it's the opposite. Other times the demand comes from the municipal staff or planners or architects. For many years it has come also from equity, from the staff from equity departments in certain cities. They have tried to integrate this perspective in their urban policies in the city. And so oftentimes they see resistances from other areas in the city halls, because there is not also a view to work urban planning issues from a more integrative and interdisciplinary view. And also might be like some resistance from the politicians, but there are also a lot of like staff that have been able to kind of quote unquote convince the politicians to invest in this type of policies in their municipalities, even though it might be that the color of their party might seem more conservative. All right. Any other comments? Hello. Any other comments or questions? I mean, that's all like summary, but you're welcome, Sophia. Of course, we are on a moment that is very critical. There are a lot of people is interested in how we can make cities that are focused more on the life of people, right, with the current pandemic. And we receive a lot of calls, etc. But it's also a difficult moment for feminist organizations like ours, that oftentimes the work that we do is not valued enough. And so we struggle between this balance of how we can contribute and we can work, and how we can survive as organizations and as workers, because we are afraid also of the consequences of the crisis that is going to come, that at the end, if we are not changing the system, it's going to be falling in the shoulders of the labor. And thank you for listening. It's always difficult to talk without seeing the faces of people. So thank you. Oh, thank you for putting the camera. But I have to confess that I really like the UrbanA sessions, because they really try hard to make it more interactive. Let's go to the May session. A pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Sarah.